You are not on the list, Ethan. You are not family anymore.
No!
I am family!
It's over, Ethan. Let me go!
Claire held my invitation between two fingers, tore it in half, and let the pieces fall beside my shoes. Her father lifted his champagne and told security to remove the broke handyman before I embarrassed them. Neither of them knew the hotel, the auction, and every camera in the room answered to me. For 7 years, Claire Bellamy had introduced me as the man who repaired old buildings for a living. She said it with a smile when we were alone. But at public events, the same sentence sounded like an apology. Her father, Conrad, never bothered with a smile. To him, a man who worked with dust on his sleeves was a temporary mistake his daughter would eventually correct. What neither of them understood was that I had spent those 7 years living without the name printed on my birth certificate. I wanted one part of my life untouched by money. Boards, inheritance lawyers, and people who measured affection against access. I believed Claire had chosen Ethan Reed, the restoration carpenter, not Ethan Rowan, sole heir to Rowan Meridian Holdings. That belief survived longer than it should have. It survived the private jokes about my truck, the dinners where Conrad asked whether I had considered a real career, and the way Claire stopped inviting me to client meetings once she became chief executive of Bellamy Heritage Auctions. Love can make patience look like loyalty, even when patience is only fear wearing better clothes. The night they ordered me dragged from the Vesper Hotel was not the beginning. It was only the first moment their contempt became expensive. By then, Claire and Conrad had already forged my signature, pledged property they did not own, and placed a painting from my mother's trust into an auction catalog under a false history. They thought I lacked the power to object. They were wrong about the power, but that was not the mistake that mattered most. Their real mistake was believing power determined whether I deserved honesty. A man should not need $1 billion inheritance before his wife decides stealing from him is wrong. Stay with me. Because the truth did not arrive with a shouted confession. It arrived one document at a time. I met Claire at a neighborhood theater restoration in Milwaukee. Her company had donated antique fixtures for the lobby, and I was rebuilding a carved walnut balcony rail that had survived a fire. She watched me fit a damaged section by hand and said patience was the rarest luxury in the world. I told her patience was cheaper than replacing history. She laughed. And for a while, that laugh became the sound I trusted most. Claire was clever, composed, and able to remember every detail people revealed when they believed she was only making conversation. She loved art because objects carried stories. I loved restoration because broken things could still carry weight. At the time, those values seemed close enough to build a marriage on. We married 16 months later in the same theater after it reopened. There were 80 guests, paper lanterns, a jazz trio, and no mention of the Rowan name. My inheritance remained inside a trustee structure created after my father's death, and my voting control would not transfer until a long dispute involving overseas partners was settled. I was wealthy on paper and deliberately ordinary in practice. Claire knew my parents had died and that distant trustees handled a modest family estate. That description was technically true, though it left out several hotels, logistics terminals, private credit funds, and an art collection large enough to have its own conservation staff. I did not lie about loving her. I lied by omission about the machinery waiting behind my name. Then Conrad suffered a mild stroke and stepped back from daily operations. Claire became chief executive of Bellamy Heritage Auctions, a company her grandfather had founded and her father had expanded into a regional brand. The promotion changed her schedule first, then her wardrobe, then the way she evaluated every room. Soon she was measuring people by what doors they could open. Conrad encouraged it. He had always believed reputation was a form of currency. But after his illness, he became obsessed with leaving a dynasty. He pushed Claire to pursue national consignments, museum partnerships, and a televised winter auction at the Royal Vesper, the most prestigious hotel in the city. He also began asking why his daughter was still married to someone without influence. I heard the answer through a door one evening. Claire said I was steady, loyal, and useful at home. but not someone who could help her reach the next level. Conrad replied that usefulness was not partnership. I stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of tea and waited for one of them to say something that made the sentence less cruel. Neither did. The next person to enter their world was Adrian Locke, a private art financier from New York. He arrived with cufflinks shaped like tiny crowns and a reputation for turning uncertain collections into immediate cash. Conrad admired his confidence. Claire admired the speed with which important people returned his calls. Adrian looked at me once and decided I was furniture. He advised Bellamy Heritage to expand before the winter auction, promising a group of European consigners if the company could show stronger liquidity. The expansion required a bridge facility of $6 million. Banks hesitated because several client payments had already been used to cover operating expenses. Adrian said the problem was not debt. The problem was finding collateral no one would question. The first warning arrived as an email from a conservation registrar named Mira Solis. She asked why Winter Orchard, a small landscape by Elise Vardon, had appeared in Bellamy Heritage's private preview catalog. The painting belonged to the Rowan Family Art Trust and had hung in my mother's study until her death. It was not famous, but its ownership record was exact and legally protected. I opened the catalog on my phone and stared at the image. Bellamy Heritage described the painting as property from an anonymous Midwestern estate, acquired through a domestic settlement and cleared for sale by the owner's spouse. My name did not appear, but a scanned authorization signature did. It looked enough like mine to pass until someone compared the angles of the final letters. Claire had seen the painting only twice, after my mother died. It remained in climate storage with a handful of personal pieces I could not yet bear to display. I had once told Claire it might be worth $20,000. I never explained that its value was less important than the chain of title linking it to a collection insured for hundreds of millions. I called her from the library basement. She did not sound surprised. She said Conrad had located the painting in old household records and believed selling it would help both of us. When I asked who authorized the consignment, she told me not to become dramatic over an object gathering dust. Then she said the paperwork was already complete and ending the sale would damage her credibility. I asked a second question. Had she signed my name? The silence lasted 3 seconds. Claire finally said married people signed routine documents for each other all the time. I told her an art consignment worth millions on paper was not a routine document. She laughed once, without humor, and asked whether I truly intended to humiliate her over a painting I had ignored for years. That phrase stayed with me, humiliate her. Not betray me. Not expose us. Not risk a crime. In her mind, the damage began only when her public image became vulnerable. I ended the call and contacted Mira. She sent me the full consignment file, including a spousal authorization, a property affidavit, and a collateral schedule attached to Adrian's bridge facility. The collateral schedule contained more than the painting. It listed our house, described as unencumbered property owned jointly by Claire Bellamy and Ethan Reed. The house was not ours. It belonged to Northbridge Residential Trust, one of the Rowan family structures, and we lived there under a private occupancy agreement. Claire had signed that agreement before our wedding without reading beyond the first page. My driver's license, tax returns, and a digital copy of my signature had been attached to the loan package. The tax returns were from the modest salary I earned at the restoration nonprofit, which made me look safe enough to control and poor enough to ignore. Someone had also altered the trust occupancy agreement to remove the paragraph stating that neither resident held title. I sat alone on a stack of boxed books while water pumps throbbed behind the library walls. The first emotion was not anger. It was disbelief searching for an exit. I kept looking for a clerical explanation, because accepting the obvious meant admitting my wife had used the privacy I gave her as a tool against me. Some truths hurt most because they rearrange your memories. I called Miriam Vale, general counsel to the Rowan trustees. She had known me since I was 19 and had never once mistaken calm for weakness. Before I finished describing the altered agreement, she asked me to stop sending messages from shared devices. Within an hour, she had frozen the art trust file, challenged the collateral, and preserved access logs from our home accounts. Miriam also told me something I had not yet considered. Bellamy Heritage's winter auction was scheduled at the Royal Vesper because Rowan Meridian owned the hotel through a hospitality subsidiary. The event contract included strict representations about legal title, client funds, and consigned property. A false affidavit would not merely void one's sale. It could trigger a full compliance review. I asked her not to reveal my identity. My transfer of voting authority was days from completion. But only the trustees, senior counsel, and 3 board members knew the final date. Bellamy Heritage believed it was dealing with a remote corporate committee. Claire believed my family estate was a minor fund that paid insurance and taxes. I needed to know how far she had gone before the truth changed her behavior. The access logs answered quickly. Claire had downloaded my tax records 4 months earlier while I was in Madison supervising a school restoration. Conrad's assistant had scanned the occupancy agreement. Adrian's office had produced the altered version. A message from Claire to Adrian asked whether my signature was clean enough for internal review and whether anyone would contact me directly. His reply was simple, not if the borrower controlled the relationship. Claire then wrote that I hated conflict and would never risk a public scene. Conrad added a separate note saying I had no lawyer, no family nearby, and no understanding of sophisticated finance. 3 people had built a $6 million gamble on their shared belief that I would be too embarrassed to defend myself. The deeper review exposed a second problem. Bellamy Heritage had been moving consignor deposits into operating accounts for nearly a year. Payments meant for sellers were delayed while the company funded renovations, marketing, and Adrian's advisory fees. The auction house still looked elegant from the street. But inside, every new consignment was being used to cover an older promise. Several employees had also gone unpaid for overtime. A widow waiting for proceeds from her husband's watch collection had been told the buyer's funds were delayed, even though the money had arrived weeks earlier. A local museum had loaned decorative pieces for a preview and never received the promised insurance certificate. This was no longer a family betrayal. It was a structure harming people who had never met me. When the lender notified Bellamy Heritage that the collateral had been challenged, Claire came home before I did. She was waiting in the kitchen with Conrad and Adrian. My work boots were still wet from snow. Conrad told me to sit down as if the house belonged to him. Adrian placed a withdrawal form on the table and said signing it would make the problem disappear. I read the first page. The form required me to confirm that I had authorized the original documents and was now voluntarily releasing any dispute. It also included a confidentiality clause and an acknowledgement that Winter Orchard was marital property. I asked Adrian whether he had drafted it. He said experienced people were trying to protect me from consequences I did not understand. Claire did not apologize. She said the company had carried our lifestyle while I played with old wood for charity. That sentence was false in every measurable way. But what struck me was how easily she believed it. The trust paid the house expenses. My salary covered most daily costs. Yet she had repeated Conrad's story so often that it had replaced our actual marriage. I told them I would not sign. Conrad leaned forward and said men in my position should recognize generosity when it was offered. I asked what position he meant. He looked at my jacket, my boots, and the dust under my fingernails. A dependent one, he said. Adrian smiled at the table, careful not to let me see how relieved he was that Conrad had spoken first. Then Claire said she had already instructed security at the winter auction to remove me if I appeared. She accused me of trying to destroy the biggest night of her career because I was jealous of Adrian's success. I asked whether their relationship was professional. She answered too quickly. And Adrian looked toward the window. Sometimes a lie reveals itself through timing before evidence ever arrives. Miriam found the evidence the following morning. Adrian's advisory company had received $800,000 from the bridge facility, far above the disclosed fee. 2 hotel suites in Manhattan, a bracelet delivered to Claire's office, and a lease deposit for a condominium were charged through related accounts. The condominium application listed Claire and Adrian as intended occupants. I read the documents in Miriam's conference room without speaking. The marriage did not end when I saw the lease. It ended when I noticed the planned move-in date was 3 weeks after the winter auction. Claire had already scheduled a future that did not include me. She simply needed my signature, my silence, and my trust-owned property to finance the transition. Miriam asked whether I wanted the hotel contract canceled immediately. I could have ended the auction with one call. Bellamy Heritage would have collapsed before sunset, and Conrad would have spent the night explaining missing client money to every newspaper in the state. Part of me wanted that clean destruction. Anger prefers simple solutions because simple solutions feel like control. But 112 employees depended on the auction house. Dozens of families had property scheduled for sale. Small businesses had supplied food, lighting, transport, security, and catalog printing on credit. None of them had forged my name. If I crushed the company without a rescue plan, the people least responsible would absorb the first and hardest blow. I asked Miriam to prepare a controlled intervention instead. Rowan Meridian would acquire Bellamy Heritage's valid contracts and essential operations through a receivership structure if the court approved. Client funds would be separated, unpaid staff made whole, and legitimate consignments completed. Conrad, Claire, and Adrian would receive no protection from the criminal or civil evidence. The trustees agreed, but only after I accepted formal control of Rowan Meridian 2 days before the auction. My father's final voting restrictions expired at noon on a Wednesday. At 12:15, the board recognized me as executive chairman. The announcement remained confidential until the hotel event because regulators, lenders, and employees had to be notified in a coordinated sequence. That same afternoon, Claire filed for divorce. Her petition described me as an underemployed spouse who had contributed little to the marriage. She requested sole occupancy of the house, half of the family artwork, and reimbursement for supporting my nonprofit lifestyle. She also accused me of stalking her business contacts after I challenged the forged consignment. Conrad arranged an interview with a local luxury magazine. He said his daughter had spent years carrying a resentful husband who could not tolerate female success. The article included a photograph of Claire standing beside Adrian beneath the Royal Vespers chandelier. Within hours, donors called my restoration nonprofit, asking whether I had misused organizational funds to support a personal lawsuit. I had spent 11 years rebuilding libraries, theaters, schools, and homes after storms. None of that mattered to people who had only seen one polished photograph and a confident accusation. Our board placed me on temporary leave while counsel reviewed the claims. I understood why they did it. But walking out with my tool bag felt like losing the one identity I had chosen for myself. Claire changed the locks at the house that evening. My clothes were packed into contractor bags and stacked beside the garage. A note taped to the door said I should learn what it felt like to lose something I had not earned. I stood in the snow reading that line beneath a security camera owned by my own family trust. The absurdity was too sharp to be funny. Miriam offered to have the locks changed back immediately. I told her not to. I did not want another night under a roof where every room had become evidence. I moved into a quiet suite at the Royal Vesper under a staff alias. The hotel manager, Daniel Joe, had known my father and said nothing when I arrived carrying 2 bags and a box of woodworking tools. From that room, I watched Bellamy Heritage prepare the auction designed to save it. Television crews tested lights in the ballroom. Catalogs arrived with Winter Orchard printed across the cover. Claire posted videos about courage, reinvention, and refusing to be held back by small-minded people. Every sentence was aimed at me, though my name was never spoken. Adrian told lenders the disputed collateral would be resolved during the event. Conrad promised consigners that a strategic partnership with Rowan Meridian would be announced from the stage. No such partnership had ever been approved. In reality, the board had scheduled a compliance declaration, a receivership notice, and my introduction as chairman. They were celebrating an outcome that existed only in Adrian's sales pitch. 2 nights before the auction, Claire sent me a message containing a photograph of her gown beside Adrian's tuxedo. She wrote that the Vesper was built for people who created value, not men who repaired what others had built. I almost replied with the original deed to the hotel. Instead, I forwarded the message to Miriam and turned off the phone. There is a kind of calm that arrives after grief has finished arguing with reality. I no longer wanted Claire to understand me. I no longer wanted Conrad to apologize or Adrian to admit what he had done. I wanted the employees paid, the consignors protected, the forged documents exposed, and the truth recorded somewhere no polished interview could erase it. On the afternoon of the auction, Daniel brought a black suit to my room. It had belonged to no one and carried no family crest. I chose it because I did not want wealth announcing me before the evidence did. The only item connected to my father was a narrow silver watch he had worn when he opened the first Royal Vesper property 30 years earlier. The ballroom below had been transformed into a theater of certainty. Ivory drapes framed the stage. Glass cases held jewelry under white light, and waiters carried champagne past people who spoke in low voices about acquisitions and influence. Bellamy Heritage's name appeared on every screen. Rowan Meridian's name appeared only once, beneath the words prospective strategic partner. I entered through the main doors with a valid shareholder credential in my pocket. The guest list attendant scanned it, frowned at her tablet, and quietly called a supervisor. Before he arrived, Claire saw me. She crossed the marble floor so quickly that several guests turned. Adrian followed at a distance, his expression already searching for the safest place to stand. Claire asked how I had entered. I told her I had come to ask one final question before the program began. She said there was nothing left to discuss. I asked whether she would admit, in front of Conrad and the lender, that she had signed my name on the consignment and collateral papers. Her face hardened, and she said I was having another jealous episode. Conrad appeared with 2 security officers. He announced loudly that I had been harassing his daughter for weeks and had no invitation. I held out my credential, but he knocked my hand aside before anyone could read it. The card slid beneath a cocktail table. Guests began lifting phones, drawn toward humiliation the way people gather around broken glass. I told Conrad the painting on the cover did not belong to Bellamy Heritage. Claire, or me personally, it belonged to a protected trust, and the authorization was forged. He raised his champagne and said I had spent years inventing importance because I possessed none. Then he poured the drink down the front of my suit and told security to take out the trash. Claire did not stop him. She picked up one half of my torn invitation from the floor, pressed it against my wet jacket, and said this was the closest I would ever come to belonging in a room like that. A few people laughed because they believed laughter was the safest side to choose. Adrian looked toward the stage. He knew something they did not. The officers reached for my arms. Before either touched me, Daniel Cho's voice came through the ballroom speakers. He asked security to stand down and requested that all guests take their seats. Conrad demanded the microphone be cut. Daniel ignored him and introduced Miriam Vale, General Counsel for Rowan Meridian Holdings, who walked onto the stage carrying 3 sealed folders. Miriam did not look at me first. She looked at the cameras. She announced that Rowan Meridian had completed a scheduled review of Bellamy Heritage's representations, client accounts, and collateral. The proposed partnership was denied. A court petition for emergency receivership had been filed that morning. Every valid consignment would be protected while operations transferred to independent control. The laughter disappeared. Conrad's hand remained raised. Empty glass tilted toward the floor. Claire stared at the stage as if the words were arriving in another language. Adrian took one step backward. Miriam then said the board's newly recognized executive chairman would explain the ownership conflict involving Winter Orchard and the Royal Vesper. Every director seated at the front table stood, not dramatically, not in perfect unison, but with the practiced respect of people acknowledging authority. Daniel turned toward me and said my full name, Ethan Alexander Rowan. For the first time that night, Claire looked at the silver watch on my wrist and recognized the same compass emblem printed in the hotel lobby. Miriam introduced me as the sole beneficiary of the Rowan Family Art Trust, controlling heir of Rowan Meridian Holdings, and chairman of the company that owned the Royal Vesper. The security officers released the empty space beside my arms. Conrad's face lost color. Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came. Adrian moved another step away from her. I walked to the stage with champagne still darkening my shirt. I could have used the microphone to repeat every insult. I could have told the room about the changed locks, the contractor bags, the magazine article, and the condominium Claire planned to share with Adrian. Instead, I said status does not transform character. It only removes excuses for hiding it. Then I asked the guests to remain seated while the compliance team explained how their property and payments would be protected. The point of the evening was not my revenge. It was preventing innocent people from paying for decisions made above them. That distinction mattered to me, even if it meant the most dramatic part of the story happened in a private conference room. Claire, Conrad, and Adrian were escorted there by hotel counsel, not security. Miriam placed the original trust registry on the table first. It showed Winter Orchard entering the Rowan collection 22 years earlier and remaining under continuous protected ownership. The forged spousal authorization could not transfer title, and the false catalog description exposed Bellamy Heritage to fraud claims. Next came the occupancy agreement for the house. Miriam laid the genuine version beside the altered copy submitted to the lender. The genuine document stated in bold type that neither occupant possessed ownership rights. The altered copy removed that paragraph and replaced the signature page. Conrad stared at the pages without blinking. Claire studied the table. The access logs followed. They showed Claire opening my tax folder, Conrad's assistant scanning the agreement, and Adrian's staff uploading a modified file. A message chain documented their discussion about whether I would challenge the transaction. Conrad had written that I lacked the money to survive a legal fight. Miriam read that sentence once, then let the silence finish it. Adrian spoke first. He claimed he had relied on information supplied by Bellamy Heritage and assumed the signatures were authentic. Miriam slid his invoice across the table, followed by the metadata from the signature template created on his office computer. Then she placed the message where he promised Claire no one would contact me if she managed the domestic risk. Claire turned toward him with a look I had once mistaken for strength. She accused him of promising the loan was safe, the partnership guaranteed, and the documents routine. Adrian answered that she was the chief executive and had signed every certification. Their relationship collapsed in less than a minute because it had never been built on loyalty. It had been built on shared advantage. Conrad tried to separate himself from both of them. He said age and illness had limited his involvement, and that Claire controlled daily decisions. Miriam opened the third folder. Inside was his voice memo instructing staff to remove the trust language, along with his email calling me a harmless dependent who will fold once Claire threatens divorce. He stopped speaking before the recording ended. The final records concerned the money. Client proceeds had been redirected into expansion costs. Adrian's company received $800,000. Claire's bracelet, the condominium deposit, and private travel were paid through connected accounts. Unpaid employees and sellers were effectively financing a celebration intended to convince them everything was secure. Claire finally looked at me. Her anger had changed shape. She said I had deceived her by hiding the Rowan name and that none of this would have happened if she had known who I was. The argument sounded rehearsed because it allowed her to treat my identity as the cause and her choices as the reaction. I asked whether knowing I was rich would have made forgery wrong. She did not answer. I told her the marriage was over long before the announcement, because a husband should not need to own the hotel before his wife protects his dignity. Conrad said I was enjoying the spectacle. I reminded him the spectacle began when he poured champagne on a man he believed could not respond. Power had not created his contempt. It had only exposed its target. Miriam explained the immediate terms. Bellamy Heritage's leadership authority was suspended. An independent receiver would control accounts and inventory. Rowan Meridian would provide limited financing only for protected client obligations, payroll, insurance, and vendor payments. No funds would cover personal debts, legal defenses, or ownership payouts for Claire or Conrad. Adrian's contract was terminated, and his communications were preserved for investigators. He asked whether cooperation could reduce his exposure. Conrad called him a coward. Adrian replied that Conrad had taught him every relationship was a transaction. It was the first honest statement either man made that evening. and it revealed why their alliance had always been temporary. Back in the ballroom, the receiver addressed the guests. Sellers would receive updated account statements within 48 hours. Buyers' funds would be held in escrow. No object with disputed title would be offered. Employees were asked to report missing wages confidentially. The auction itself was postponed. But the people who had trusted the company were not abandoned. Winter Orchard was removed from its glass display and transferred to the hotel's secure art room. I watched 2 registrars carry it away. The painting showed a line of bare trees under a pale winter sky. Nothing grand enough to explain the damage done around it. My mother had loved it because the artist painted endurance without making endurance look heroic. Police did not arrest anyone in the ballroom. Real consequences are often slower and less theatrical than stories suggest. Subpoenas arrived the next week. Lenders filed claims. State investigators examined the altered documents and missing client money. Claire's public interview was removed after the magazine received copies of the court filings. But the recording had already traveled far. I resigned as executive director and stayed on as an unpaid technical advisor. The decision hurt. But the organization needed freedom from my family story. Rowan Meridian created a separate grant with independent oversight. And I was barred from directing awards. I had learned that even good intentions become dangerous when power controls both the problem and the praise. The receivership saved most of Bellamy Heritage's employees. 2 offices closed, but payroll was restored. Overdue seller proceeds were distributed, and insured consignments returned or sold under transparent terms. The company reopened months later under the name Northline Auctions, led by professionals with no connection to the Bellamy family. Conrad lost the business his father had founded. Investigators determined he had directed the document alteration and approved the misuse of client accounts. His attorneys negotiated, delayed, and blamed subordinates. But the paper trail was patient. Reputation had protected him for years because people confused confidence with credibility. Records made no such mistake. Adrian cooperated early. He provided messages, banking instructions, and recordings in exchange for consideration from prosecutors. His cooperation hurt Claire and Conrad, but it did not make him noble. A man who abandons partners when the room changes is not suddenly truthful. He is simply loyal to the newest source of safety. Claire's case took longer. She admitted signing my name, but claimed she believed marriage gave her implied authority. The altered trust document and private messages weakened that defense. She also faced civil claims from sellers and employees. By the time our divorce hearing began, the confident executive from the magazine photograph seemed exhausted by the weight of facts she could no longer edit. She requested a private settlement and apologized for how events unfolded. Miriam returned the draft because the language accepted no responsibility. Claire sent another version saying pressure, Conrad, and Adrian had distorted her judgment. I agreed to resolve the marital assets only after she acknowledged the forged authorization. The false affidavit and the public accusations were her decisions. The house remained with Northbridge Residential Trust. Claire received her personal property and the legitimate portion of our shared savings. I did not seek damages beyond documented losses, legal costs, and restoration of the painting. Punishment was not the purpose. Accountability was. There is a difference between wanting someone to suffer and refusing to finance their escape. Our divorce became final 11 months after the auction. Claire asked to speak without lawyers in the courthouse corridor. She said she had loved the man she thought I was and felt betrayed by the man I turned out to be. I told her I had not turned into Ethan Rowan at the Vesper. I had been the same person when she left my clothes in the snow. She asked whether I had ever planned to tell her. I said yes, after the trustee dispute ended, though I no longer knew whether waiting had been wise. Hiding my inheritance had denied her a fact relevant to our marriage, but no missing fact authorized theft. 2 truths can stand beside each other without canceling either one, and admitting my fault did not erase hers. Conrad never apologized. Through his attorneys, he insisted the company would have survived if I had not challenged the loan. That claim revealed he still believed exposure caused the collapse rather than misconduct. Some people would rather blame the alarm than admit they lit the fire. I stopped waiting for him to understand because understanding was not required for consequences. Winter Orchard now hangs in a quiet corridor outside the hotel's public library. The label names the artist, provenance, and conservation history. But not the scandal. I did not want my mother's painting reduced to evidence of someone else's betrayal. Objects deserve more than the worst thing people once tried to do with them. Mira Solis became director of a new Rowan Meridian Provenance unit. Her team offers free title reviews to small museums, families, and nonprofits before high-value sales. The service began because one registrar sent an uncomfortable email instead of assuming powerful people had checked the paperwork. Integrity often enters a story through someone willing to ask a precise question. We also established the Quiet Title Project, which provides legal help to people whose spouses or relatives forged signatures, pledged shared property, or hid debt behind domestic trust. I refuse to put my name on the organization. Victims should not have to perform gratitude toward a billionaire to receive protection. Assistance works best when dignity is part of the design. At the project's first annual fundraiser, a young server stumbled near my table and spilled champagne across my sleeve. His face went white. The room noticed and waited, perhaps remembering the video from the winter auction. I took a napkin, helped steady the tray, and told him an accident did not become a character test until someone chose how to respond. What happened at the Royal Vesper was never truly about discovering that I was rich. The guests changed their posture when they heard my name. But my worth had not increased between the spilled champagne and the board's introduction. Only their information changed. That is why public reversals feel satisfying and still leave something unsettled beneath the satisfaction. Claire and Conrad were wrong before they knew I controlled the hotel. They were wrong when they believed I repaired buildings because I lacked ambition. They were wrong when they treated employees, sellers, and vendors as resources instead of people. Wealth gave me tools to stop them, but it did not create the moral reason. The reason existed when I appeared powerless. I sometimes wonder whether the marriage would have survived if I had revealed everything on our first date. Perhaps Claire would have behaved differently. That possibility no longer comforts me. Kindness offered only to a hidden heir is not kindness. Loyalty that depends on a balance sheet is not loyalty. A marriage cannot be secured by keeping the correct number visible. The lesson I carried forward was less dramatic than the headline. Protect your documents. Read what you sign. Separate affection from financial consent. And when someone tells you a boundary is an insult, look carefully at what they gain by making you ashamed of having one. Contempt often disguises itself as urgency when it needs your cooperation. I still restore old wood on weekends. There is a workbench in the Vesper basement where I repair chairs too damaged for the hotel's usual contractors. Most guests never see it. That is fine. I no longer need ordinary work to prove I am different from my inheritance. And I no longer need the inheritance to prove the work matters. Bellamy Heritage had chandeliers, velvet catalogs, famous clients, and a founder's name engraved above the door. None of those things could support a company hollowed by deception. The rescue succeeded only after the image was separated from the obligations underneath it. The same is true of people. A polished story cannot carry weight forever when the structure beneath it is false. So when people ask what I felt as the board stood and Claire realized who I was, I tell them the truth. I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. The man she had dismissed and the heir she suddenly feared were never two different people. The distance between them existed only in her judgment, and that judgment had finally become visible to everyone. If this story stays with you, let it be for that reason. Do not wait for a title, inheritance, uniform, or room full of witnesses before deciding someone deserves respect. The clearest measure of character is how we treat people when we believe they cannot reward us, punish us, or change our future. Everything else is performance under favorable lighting. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone who confused quietness with weakness, remember that defending yourself does not require becoming cruel. Evidence can be firm. Boundaries can be final. Power can protect people beyond the person holding it. The strongest reversal is not making your enemies feel small. It is refusing to become what made them small.